Hello dear Crafterlians and welcome to an old new tutorial. This tutorial was published a year ago at our Patreon and it showcased non-metallic painting of an halberd, but also the importance of color mixing and paint interaction. So Marko and I decided this would be a good lesson to share with you today. In this lesson I will use the Lord Castellant model by Games Workshop, primed using black primer. This time I want to have a really dark base tone to start with, but not just black. I want something a bit more natural. So I will use a glaze of scale 75 Artist Burnt Sienna Umber to complement the black undertone. I will apply a layer of Burnt Sienna Umber as a glaze, as I don't want to make a rough surface nor to cover the black tone. Idea is to have this thin layer transparently overlay the black base and keep it dark, while complementing tone to more natural value. I'm adding water to my Bristol and mixing this water with the paint to thin it down. You can notice how the pigments move freely on the palette. Once again, don't load your brush with too much water. Mix your paint to a thin consistency and always check the paint density of a tissue or on your skin before applying paint to the miniature, to check if the flow is good enough. Repeat layer a few times if needed. If you are confident with layer consistency and brush use, you can move this layer while it's still wet. However, if you're not so confident, go with this step easily, slowly. Add a thin layer, carefully, wait for it to dry. Then, if needed, repeat it again. And of course, don't be afraid to practice. We learn from both mistakes and successes. Note that the most of the pigments will gather at the end of the brushstroke. So, by leaving traces of your layer, all the pigments from diluted paint will gather at the end where Bristol leave the surface. Be careful with spreading these paint pigments around and don't go into recesses. We want to keep those dark areas for a good and sharp contrast and details visibility. As you move your brush over the miniature surface, the tone of this diluted layer will be thinner on the areas where we have more water and thicker on the areas with more pigment. When the layer is dry, you can see these new tonal values that you created with just a simple application of this glaze layer of burnt sienna umber. More transparency in the glaze created darker areas, while less transparency created lighter areas. In these lighter areas, coverage of burnt sienna umber is stronger. Now, I want to play with color mixes and create a gray tone. I will create a mix between burnt sienna umber and turquoise. I'm adding turquoise paint right next to the burnt sienna umber on the palette, and I'm slowly picking burnt sienna umber paint and pulling it into a mix, gradually, while I search for a tone, something more like greenish gray. See the graphic on the right. This is the value I choose between mix of these two paints. It's not too bright in value, as I need to make smooth gradient starting from previously created base values of burnt sienna umber to lighter reflection of this non-metallic metal. Since this tone is very similar to the base layer, I will use a semi-thicker layer. Still thin enough to easily spread on the surface, but not too transparent, as I'm applying this tone in a wider light placement brushstroke over the mid and upper side of this blade, and in contrast to the lower areas of the other side of the blade. And I continued with light placement sketch in the same manner, adding this tone over the light areas while keep the base tone of burnt sienna umber over the shade reflection areas. Once again, keep in mind of the recesses. We want to keep those dark and intact. As I said, the layer is semi-thick, so we will still interact with the base tone and it might look darker upon drying. Wait for the layer to dry and see how it looks before applying a new one. For my next layer, I'm simply adding more turquoise paint into my burnt sienna and turquoise mix, getting more into bluish tonal variations. After getting the first light placements, the next steps gets easier, since we just need to follow the same path of light. Going over the same areas, I'm covering less of a surface, keeping the previous tone visible. Slowly again in a semi-thick layer, not too thin, not too thick. But if you're unsure of the tone, it's always better to go with a thin layer since it can be easily repeated and changed later. Now, to brighten up these tonal variations in a mix between burnt sienna umber and turquoise, I'm adding white paint into a mix. And since I'm still gradually building lights of this metal piece, I want just to add a tiny bit of white for a start. Just a pinch. I don't want to differentiate the next layer too much from the previous one. I want it just one step brighter. And since I am brightening up a paint mix, the tone will vary more to burnt sienna umber or more to turquoise. These are the tonal variations. And they played their part in the progress so far, and I will keep their play in the highlight process, but since the white paint will make these variations bright, the difference will be less visible than in the previous steps. Once again, I'm covering the same areas of light placements with just less surface, keeping the previous layers visible. In this step, you can proceed to more free brush strokes. For example, you can use tip of your brush to create a texture on the outside of your blade areas, adding more white slowly, gradually. And with every new step of applying a lighter layer, you can notice that I'm pulling the paint up with my brush stroke, pulling pigments up. Also, by adding white paint into a mix, I'm making these layers just a bit thicker than the previous ones. Since I'm using these brighter values to focus on definition and detailing of the non-metallic metal surface, I'm adding more white in the mix. I'm pulling other two paints, keeping tones in cohesion, gradually creating transitions between layers, not going too bright right away. Slowly adding more white. With every new layer, I'm covering less and less of the surface, starting my brushstroke from the edge, moving it to the surface, keeping the previous layers and tonal variations visible, and creating stronger light reflections of the non-metallic metal surface. To apply paint nicely and carefully on the edge, you can use this trick. Use the length of your bristle loaded with wet paint in a thicker consistency, having exceeded water removed, and slowly move it over the edge. Very subtle and delicate. Not to leave too much paint on the edge, but bright enough to leave the paint visible. Don't forget to make the area you are painting approachable. Rotate the hand holding a miniature to an angle that is suitable, so that your hand holding bristle can easily reach the detail you are painting. This way you can easily work on details and keep them tidy. For final steps, I will apply brightest values and edge highlights to connect these light placements together. Non-metallic metal surface that is highly reflective consists of light and shade reflections that create contrast on the surface, keeping it shiny looking. To leave the nice edge reflection on the middle of the blade, I will again use the texture of the sculpt. Same as for the edges, just more carefully, since the height of this detail is very delicate. I want to apply the paint layer again using the length of the bristle, but carefully and softly moving it over the surface. So softly that I swing my brush in the air a few times before I reach the surface to leave the brush stroke visible. With light placement sketch, we did half of the work, deciding on the contrast between shade and lights. Following this path, we created the tonal variations and create more values of reflective tone of the non-metallic metal surface. And in this stage, we're adding brighter values for the final contrast and edge highlight that connect these lights and define the final shape of the piece. Why edge highlighting? Because I want to show that the blade is sharp, so the edges gather the most of the light while the surface reflects it. And this light helps define the shape and look of the blades and other details of a halberd. One more trick or tip that I would like to share is that if sometimes you cannot make your hand or brush stroke steady, you can try to place your model horizontally on the table to free your painting hand. Of course, if model allows it. Now you can use this free hand to support your painting hand and to keep it steady while applying some of the careful details and edges or other delicate details. The final light reflection of the layer is the thickest. I'm using clear white paint to add the final light placement on the top of the sharp edges and points of the halberd. I am using Scale 75 Artist White Paint, and this paint has very smooth and fine pigments. So I added just a tiny drop of water to keep my brush tip sharp and apply this final layer. The most important part to make this halberd look bright and shiny is contrast. So you can notice that I placed the strongest lights next to the strongest shades, creating strong contrast. Lights and shades meet between edges, creating these edges looking sharp. And this is the final result. I hope you enjoyed one more video on our YouTube channel. And as I mentioned, this is the older video from our Patreon, and I hope that our students are happy to see this video again and that all of you will enjoy it. There are more videos from the Stormcast series, and you can check it on our Patreon next to other video tutorials and step-by-step PDFs. If you like this video, like, comment, share and subscribe to our channel not to miss other updates. Until the next one, kind regards from Marko and I. Cheers!